Thank you, my lady. Sir Christopher, I asked just a few questions on two topics on behalf of the long COVID groups. Were you aware that the Prime Minister wasn't convinced that long COVID truly existed in 2020 and for a large part of 2021?
I was aware of that.
Why didn't you, as Chief Medical Officer, disabuse the Prime Minister of his belief that long COVID was bollocks in October 2020 when there were discussions about the need for a second lockdown?
Well, the particular document with a handwritten note was not one I was privy to until it was published by the inquiry, so to be clear. The answer is, if I thought that there was an overriding need for the Prime Minister himself or herself, were it to be a different Prime Minister, to know about this because it was going to make a big difference to people with long COVID, that would have been a very material point. And I did, as you know, in 2021, actually address issues of long COVID directly with the Prime Minister. However, at this point, at the earlier points, my view was there were large numbers of things we needed to do for those living with long COVID who might have long COVID in due course because of infection, to do with research, which I launched multiple strands of research and analyses during 2020, and also NHS activity. None of these, in my view, required the Prime Minister to have a view on it one way or the other. We could just get on with it. So these weren't things where the views of the Prime Minister, in a sense, and I don't mean this in a negative sense, I'm just stating this factually, were relevant one way or the other. We could just do the things we needed to do. Once I got to a point where it was clear this might be a material issue for decisions the Prime Minister himself could take, that seemed the point where his private office said to me, look, could we have this discussion? And I think you have the correspondence on this. I thought about it, how we best do it, and we agreed on an approach to it.
Yeah, I'm going to go to that in a moment, but you accept that the evidence of long COVID was not in any way uncertain by that time in October 2020?
I do.
Thank you.
Although our understanding of it was far from developed, we've still got a long way to go, but it was very much in its earlier stages. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, we don't need to go through papers, but there was a literature review on long COVID. Public Health England had published guidance, and the National Institute for Health and Care Research, of which you were head, had produced a report.
Yeah, I commissioned those works.
Patrick Vallance had advised Cabinet on the 13th of October 2020 that young people suffering from long COVID was a relevant policy consideration in relation to discussions about shielding the elderly only. Why didn't you think it was important to advise him about the risk of COVID-19 causing long COVID in the young?
Well, I think, as I say, if I thought that there was a decision that the Prime Minister himself needed to take where this is a material issue, I would have addressed it. It wasn't part of my job, I still don't think it's part of my job, to disabuse even senior political leaders of things which I'm not convinced they fully understand, where I don't think it's material to the public health outcomes.
Did you not think it was important, as Chief Medical Officer, to ensure that he had that level of knowledge, particularly given the indiscriminate risk of long COVID?
Only if it would have made a difference to decisions that the Prime Minister himself had to take. That is in a sense, that's the question. It's not my job to try and provide public health more wide information where that's not going to have an implication, given all the other needs. I did want to do a lot for long COVID. We did do a lot for long COVID, but it was in the research and in the treatment spheres, not in the political sphere.
All right, well, leaving October aside, can I take you now to February 2021, when Mr Shafee had sought from you a proper briefing on long COVID for the Prime Minister? And of course, you know that was the same month the spring roadmap on the release of restrictions was being drawn up. Did you advise the Prime Minister then about long COVID in February 2021?
Yes, but the exact point where, so as you will recall from, because you've read the correspondence, my view, having a lot of experience of having discussed things with the Prime Minister on other areas, was that where he was going to have to think through an issue where he had one position and move to another position, it was less likely to work by just giving him a document. So I wanted to have a conversation with him, and I wanted to do so at a time it seemed to me we could have a serious conversation. I'm confident we did have a conversation, and I can't recall exactly what the date is, unfortunately. I would have chosen a moment I thought it was likely to be most useful to have the conversation, and I then followed it up with a subsequent note. I don't know the gap between those, which I think you have already seen, entitled A Short Note on Long COVID.
Yeah, we'll come to that briefly in a moment. But do you recall if you advised him after your conversation with Mr. Shaffi in February 2021?
Well, that's what I've just said. I'm confident we had the conversation. I'm not confident I can recall exactly when.
Well, this may help. But the Prime Minister himself said that it was some time had passed before he was told by Mr. Shaffi he'd received advice on long COVID, and said that in May 2021 he requested a note from you on long COVID, suggesting it was around that time you were clear with him about long COVID, I think, end of May, beginning of June. Does that sound right?
Well, it is certainly the case that that's when I sent the note, because that's when it's dated. I am also confident I didn't send the note in blind. My view was I needed to have a conversation with the Prime Minister before that. Where it lay between February and May, I honestly can't remember. And I'm just trying to, it'd be silly for me to try and say I can recall, because I can't.
Just to complete the point, then I'll move on. So it wouldn't make sense, would it? He'd be requesting advice from you again on long COVID in May 2021 if you'd already advised him on it.
No, I mean, I think the sensible thing with many of these things is to have a first discussion where you go through people's existing understandings and allow people to test information, and then follow it up with a more formal laying out of the logic. And if you've read the note, which I'm sure you have, it was my attempt to distill in quite a short note what was then known about long COVID. I think the indications are from your expert advisors is that that was a fairly accurate note.
Yes, because obviously by April 2021, an estimated 1.1 million people had long COVID, and you knew that.
That was in the note.
Thank you. I just want to take you on to the second topic only, please. During press conferences in 2020, you told the public that the great majority of those suffering long COVID-19 would be a short, mild illness. An example of that was the 11th of May 2020. In 2020 itself, only Sir Stephen Powis warned the public about long COVID at the press conference on the 20th of October 2020. And the first time you mentioned long COVID at a press conference was on the 5th of January 2021. Why didn't you use the press conferences to update the public about the risk of long-term impacts of COVID-19 in 2020, when Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus had publicly acknowledged long COVID needed recognition as early as August 2020?
Yeah, I think as with many of the things, if I were to rerun the press conferences, which where much of it was not under my control, to be clear, a lot of it was derived from where individual journalists went and a variety of other things, but leaving that to one side, I would have made an earlier mention of long COVID, but it's not obvious exactly what I would have said at different points along the path. So I think, depending on where it was, I would have said different things. So I don't think, I'm just sort of saying, I think there isn't a single thing you could have said. Just to acknowledge that there was long COVID would have been a useful thing to do. I think the acknowledgement would have been helpful at an earlier stage. In public, I was very clear it existed well before that in a press conference. But beyond that, a lot of this was around trying to help people make rational public health decisions, and I'm not confident exactly what the points are I would be making.
Well, I'll just develop that one vote.
You're not going to develop it very far, Mr.
I
Metzer,
will, Your
I'm
Honour.
afraid. We've got another 10 minutes to go before we can break for lunch.
You only mentioned long COVID 3 times in press conferences in 2021. Do you accept that those 3 references was not sufficient to inform the public about the risk of indiscriminate long-term debilitating illness? And do you accept that on reflection, messaging could and should have been improved?
Well, on the second of those, could messaging have been improved? I mean, the answer to that, to almost any question you could ask on disability, on ethnic minority and various other things, the answer is, of course, going to be yes. Would my talking about it more frequently in a press conference, as opposed to multiple other channels of communication, have improved the situation for people living with long COVID or prevented it? I'd need a chain of logic to be laid out that made it clear how that would have been achieved.
So sorry, just finish that. The question I put is that if the public had been aware of the risk of long COVID and they understood what it was, their symptoms.
Well, I think that was actually part of the way in which we were describing it to people about vaccination, for example, because we had a tool that would help. You know, the first thing I say in my "What can you do about long COVID?" is help people not get the COVID. And obviously vaccination was an example. So we used it in that context. There is a useful thing we can say that is hopefully going to help some people not to acquire long COVID who otherwise might have done so.
So
That's it,
thank
I'm
you, my
afraid,
lady.
Mr. Mutzer.